Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is continuing from my first video about the astrology of addiction, and in this video I will be covering the 5th, 8th, and 12th houses, which I also feel are houses connected to, you know, seeking some sort of change in consciousness of a chemical nature, maybe, because as I stated in the first video, there are all kinds of addictions. It's not just substance abuse. And I'm kind of sticking to substance abuse in these videos because I want to then go on in the third video to talk about what kind of substances each of the four elements are naturally attracted to. And remember, this is kind of for fun because when I talk about water signs, I might say, well, they're attracted to depressants. They want to numb their feelings because they feel so deeply. But you might get, a cancer person who has a coke problem. It doesn't mean that they're not going to have a problem with any other type of drug. So that's silly. But yeah, just kind of like it's more like about the archetypes or the templates that make up each sign and make up each house and how they relate to addiction. And I think another thing that I will do is talk about aspects. I don't know if I'll do that in this video or the next one that I do, because there are some aspects that you can see with people where they will tend to be dealing with, I don't know if you'd call it compulsive behaviors that make them want to use. But for instance, a hard angle from Mars to Neptune, there's that Neptune. When you see Neptune, even like friendly angles to Neptune, the idea is that the person is very comfortable with fantasy and might be very idealistic. So we know how messy life can be. And some of us, kind of shrug our shoulders and accept it. And some people, it really bothers them when people are mean or their dreams are not realized when they expected it to happen because they had this idealistic view that things were going to just happen, unfold perfectly. So, yeah. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the 5th house. The 5th house in astrology is ruled by Leo, and its ruler is the sun. And so it's not surprising that creativity, including conceiving of children, is associated with this house. So children are associated with this house. The inner child is associated with this house, and just artistic endeavors. The other big thing about the 5th house, it's the house of love, not necessarily relationships. So that would be more of the 7th house, but just the concept of love, maybe how the person feels about love. Because we can have like opinions about love that are not necessarily feeling the feelings, but just holding these ideas, and that can vary from person to person. So the 5th house is the house of pleasure, and this includes recreational sex. And I keep saying that it's so offensive that this house about conceiving children is the house of recreational sex. I mean, the 8th house is also connected to sex. Why couldn't it be that house for conceiving children? But it's not. It's the 5th house. So pleasure seeking, and this is one aspect of addiction, or somebody used a great term when they were responding to my first video this morning. I should have written it down or something because I really liked it. Maybe it was something to the effect of overindulgence, but I can't remember exactly what they said. But it doesn't have, I shouldn't use a word like addiction to mean that the person is just like this hardcore addict. it can be somebody that just overindulges, maybe way too frequently for comfort. And it's like they don't know how to stop. So there are reasons for that. It's not just dropping from the sky. There are reasons that people can't stop. Like for even eating can be, an addiction. And again, I'm going to focus more on mind-altering chemicals. But eating, why do some people have difficulty just knowing when to stop eating? And some people keep going and going. And not even talking about bulimia, I'm just talking about they have those issues like that where they eat too much and then they're like, oh my God, I ate too much. Okay. Because something about pleasure becomes compulsive for people. And it's like, oh, this is a good feeling. I want to have more of these good feelings. And other people can say, oh, that pleasure is right there waiting for me. I don't have to like just overdo it because it's not going anywhere. So it's kind of similar to me about lack consciousness, in the sense that some people they get money and it's like they feel they have to burn a hole in their pocket, or it is burning a hole in their pocket because they just can't hold on to it. And other people are able to, maybe buy a nice little thing for themselves, but then keep the rest of their money because they know they can do that thing if they want to, but they don't have to do it. It's not compulsive. And so it's a very interesting kind of nuanced thing, but it's really what can happen sometimes. And so if somebody has, let's say, oh, and the other thing too is with love, I have found when I have done private readings that, there's always going to be a certain amount of clients who have Chiron in the 5th house, for instance, sometimes in conjunction with Venus or the moon, the moon, and they are very, very sensitive to issues surrounding love and even like self-love. They may not feel like lovable to others. And that can lead to somebody trying to drown their sorrows, whatever, trying to escape those feelings, because that can be very sad to feel that way. So if you have Chiron in the 5th house, look at, what is it that you basically tell, your basic message to yourself? Do you feel that love eludes you? Is there someone that you have kind of built your life around that was an unrequited love, or somebody who you were in a relationship with at one point, but then that person might have left and you have never been able to move on from that emotionally? These kinds of things can happen because a person, like a bad breakup or rejection in love, the person is telling themselves something about that experience that puts them in a bad light. And then that's just kind of like a snowball effect, because then once you have that negative feeling, you have to do something about it. And, I totally understand why people want to escape emotional pain. We have a society that's very judgmental about people who have addictions, because we have a society that's very like telling us that we have to have all this discipline, and that if you don't have discipline, there's something seriously wrong with you. Well, that's programming. And those people who say that they don't have addictions, they probably do have addictions. They might not be drug addicts, but they might have, maybe they're people that are super materialistic and they can't do anything else because they're, or maybe like workaholics, they are missing out on other aspects of their life, and they don't see that because our society rewards certain types of addictions and says, oh, that's a good addiction. So Anyway, yeah, I can see it like if somebody has had disappointment in love and blaming themselves, that they would turn to substance abuse as a coping mechanisms. Another one that can happen if you have Saturn in the fifth house, you may have trouble just having fun. The fifth house can be anything pleasurable on your off hours, your leisure time. So it can be hobbies, it can be, I assume like parties, anything. It's artistic, so it could be going to galleries and concerts and things like that. Now, in sporting events, but when you have Saturn there, it's like you might see those things as frivolous, like that is taking up too much time that could be spent building up a person's career. And Saturn rules the 10th house of career. So if Saturn's in your fifth house, if you have artistic talent, you may only do it if you feel like you can make a career out of it. And otherwise, you may see it as frivolous. This is just in general that the person may have a really hard time having fun. Saturn is restrictive, and overly serious. The person may feel like, and they might feel awkward being in any situation where it's like a social situation because they don't know how to act. They're kind of like what we used to be called a wet blanket. So that's another time when people sometimes drink. Drinking is like the big social lubricant, and obviously there are other things people do for that as well, to loosen up, I should say. And it might not be like addictive where the person's doing it all the time, but it has its own consequences. And like I said in the first video, it's important to note that not everybody drinks, not everybody smokes weed, gets high. Some people don't do any of that. I know it seems like everybody does, but it's not true. And it's not something that people have to do. So there's a lot of peer pressure, or when you get to be middle-aged, it's a little bit pathetic to talk about peer pressure, but just any kind of, whether you want to call it pressure or just this feeling of wanting to be connected to others, what they're doing, that leads people to do it when sometimes they don't even want to. And but yeah, so those are the reasons. And another thing that Saturn in the fifth house can indicate is that somebody may have had to grow up too fast. They may have, maybe a parent died and they couldn't, they couldn't just remain an innocent child because they had to deal with that. Plus, it was like their childhood ended at that point. In some cases, even young people have to go to work because the mother doesn't have enough to support the family. There's some circumstances like that, whatever. And the child, their inner child dies that day. But we can bring that back. Even if you have Saturn in the fifth house, you can retrieve it, your inner child. And don't ask me how, but there's probably a video on YouTube for it. There's something for everything. But the thing is that can lead a person to get involved in substance abuse because they might have bitterness that they didn't get a chance to just be an innocent child for too long. And they might remember the before and after, like how they used to be, and they felt free. And sometimes people, when they get intoxicated, they feel that sense of freedom. But that's what I was also saying too about somebody who's uptight and maybe like feels inhibited, that makes it hard for them to have fun. That gives them that way to feel more like they can have fun. It's not like necessary, but it's talking about what the motivations are. Sometimes people use some kind of substance to open up creatively. And it's very interesting because, I think about some of these artists in the 60s who used pot or marijuana to do so because that was something that became more in the mainstream during the 60s. And then, of course, what you call a heavier psychedelic like acid, LSD or some other type of hallucinogen. And I can't remember which artist. They were saying that at first, something to the effect that at first, it really felt like it was opening up, but then they realized that they weren't creating quality content while they were under the influence. And and of course, something that is going to create more so-called energy, it's actually fake energy, but like cocaine, speed, that kind of thing, people may use that so they can just keep awake because they're on a roll and they're trying to crank out a number of, if they have some kind of like artistic project, somebody who's a script writer, maybe in Hollywood or something, and they're on a deadline and they're trying to do it. So that's that's a bit of a stretch, but that kind of thing does happen. So in the 8th house, we're looking at Scorpio's domain and the house of transformation. And this is a water house because Scorpio's a water sign. And that means that the affairs of that house are going to be felt through the emotions and through the spiritual experiences. I like to say that, comparing the 8th to the 12th houses, which I'm going to be talking about the 12th house in a minute, but the 8th house is more of the other side, like talking about the transformation that has to do with death, the death process. So a person who is having a psychic experience that's connected to the 8th house, it would be like maybe talking to the dead. Now, of course, they're not dead, but I mean, they're not here on this side of the veil. So seances, being a medium, channeling, that sort of thing. So, so definitely supernatural. And if someone has planets in the 8th house that might be particularly connected to this issue of transformation, but also I would say trauma, because this can be life and death situations. So somebody who has Mars in the 8th house, somebody who has Pluto, which is one of the rulers of the 8th, along with Mars, those are the two rulers of Scorpio. Or let's see, what other planets? Saturn can be, but Saturn, it will be more, it's not going to be the same influence. So I'm not going to focus on that right this second, but Chiron in the 8th, because that could indicate trauma or wounding. The person may, in some cases, have had a near-death experience, maybe through an accident or what have you, or that they experience some kind of abuse, violence, sexual abuse, Mars and Pluto, Mars and or Pluto here. And therefore, they really have an understanding of the fact that, there can be some really extreme situations that people find themselves in. Sometimes when people go through things like that, when they get older and they're away from their abuser, like if the abuser is a parent, specifically, it can feel like this void, because it's like all of a sudden they don't have that kind of situation anymore. And maybe it was something that they had dreamed about, of being away from that abuser, and now it's like life is a void. And so sometimes, if the person is really actively committed to healing, they will be probably in therapy, or they will be with some kind of spiritual outfit where they're trying to make sense of what happened and heal from it. But some people, they don't do that, and it's like they reenact it in a sense, all of the drama, all of the danger. And they can do that in a number of ways that where they're risking death, like they put themselves in dangerous situations, maybe with dangerous people. And drugs can be dangerous. I mentioned that in the other video. Some of these drugs, I mean, they could actually kill somebody on contact. And they have to be very mindful of it. Or the person has had so much trauma, they can't function. I mean, they're just like very anxious. And I want to say that I'm not trying to shame anyone who is self-medicating and using some kind of drug or alcohol to cope or to function, or taking a pharmaceutical drug to do so, but just being mindful of, what the end game is. Does the person expect to take this drug for the rest of their life, or do they have, is it just temporary because they're like really like non-functioning? But remember too that if a drug can lead to physical addiction, that it can be hard to wean off of it, and that can make it very dangerous as well. So it's like the situational thing of like, oh yes, I've been through a lot of trauma, so I'm going to take this drug. And sometimes they are prescribed by medical doctors. Take Xanax, take Klonopin, I don't know the name of that. That was the one that Stevie Nicks took to get off of cocaine, and she became a zombie. Or she said she did. But I mean, these drugs that people can take for years and they find very hard to get off of them because they were in a very vulnerable state where they felt anxious. They were having panic attacks. They were reliving trauma that, the 8th house kind of talks about. Oh, that reminds me. Another thing is I talked about sex, the 8th house. The 8th house is the house of intimacy. And it can obviously be in the form of sex, but it can be also emotional intimacy. A person who has been sexually abused, and, a lot of this is going to be females, but there are certainly males who have experienced this as well. When a person gets to be a certain age, like maybe they can avoid it in their teens, but when they get into their 20s and they really do want to have a partner, it can be very difficult when they feel that sex is part of that deal. And they may use something to loosen up. But every time that they are going to have sex, they have to take something. And they may not even enjoy sex because they're just trying to please that other person so that other person will stay around. So that's another example of habitually using some kind of mind-altering substance so you can appear to be more relaxed during sex, but also just feeling that sense of intimacy, because a lot of people, it's almost like sex can become a drug for some people who are looking for love and they're looking for deep connection, but they are with somebody who is just into the sex. So that can happen as well, and that person may feel like they're trying to get their emotional needs met through sex, and it doesn't work that way. They may feel more and more alienated if they are with somebody who is just like, a friend with benefits or whatever, or one night stand, and that person leaves, or maybe it's a 10-night stand. It happens every week after the bar closes, and they go home with a person, but it never progresses. It's just a sex thing. So people can take drugs, including alcohol, in order to break down those barriers or to feel like they are bonding with someone, but they're really not, because it's all on the surface. It's not really what it is, because the drugs wear off and the person goes home and they just do it again the next week. So looking at the issue of intimacy, how hard is it for you to be intimate with someone, even just on the emotional level, let alone sexual? And sometimes this is because of lack, somebody who has trust issues. Trauma can create situations where a caregiver has broken the bonds of trust. You don't feel safe with that person. I mean, that's the ultimate, I guess. But I mean, I guess even if it's not physical or sexual abuse, it's still, you could not feel emotionally safe if it's emotional abuse. So you can feel like everybody is capable of, traumatizing you, bringing pain onto you, and it becomes hard to trust anybody at a deep level. Maybe you keep yourself at arm's length from even like friends, like not even talking about the things that you're scared about, sharing your vulnerability, in other words. You might be afraid to do that. And, truth be told, this is why some people, they do, like they'll get drunk and then they will bare their soul to someone. And the next day they're mortified because they put themselves in that vulnerable position, but they needed to. At a deep level, they needed to purge. The 8th house is a shadow, and purging is part of this process, but also the theme that the 8th house represents of, the lower nature being in control from a subconscious standpoint. Sometimes people, you'll see people that are do-gooders. I'll see it on Twitter all the damn time, where they have bios where they're like, oh, love and light, blah, blah, blah. And they say the vilest things. And you're like, how could somebody be that, you could say hypocritical, but like, where is that even coming from? Well, it's coming from their shadow self. And they have a lot of inner demons or inner rage, these really dark emotions, the difficult emotions like rage, envy, jealousy, deep fears, and they don't want to acknowledge them because maybe it makes them feel guilty. Like if your sun is in Libra, I always talk about that. Or even like if your sun is in Pisces, where you do have that sacrificial part of yourself, but you're human. And you came here to achieve things that you want to achieve. You didn't just come here to sacrifice for others. And you may have inner resentments about that, but it's hard to really acknowledge that because you feel like a monster or something along those lines. And basically, this is why I honestly believe that some people who drink, this happens a lot with alcohol, where they are, mild-mannered normally, but then they turn into a monster. I believe that these kinds of people may have, when they were young, experienced a lot of trauma, maybe a lot of abuse, and they somehow were able to kind of hold it down within themselves and to function on a daily basis, but it all comes out when they drink. And some people, when they drink, they become more vulnerable. They cry easier. Sometimes they become very maudlin, where they just are, corny, very sentimental, but in a corny way. And it's because, and normally they have a stiff upper lip. This is all the shadow element that they're keeping at bay. When you integrate the shadow, it doesn't mean that you never have uncomfortable emotions again. That's not what it's about. It means that you're comfortable with your uncomfortable emotions. You accept the fact that sometimes you feel like this extreme, maybe you feel this extreme anger towards someone or resentment, and you don't have to feel guilty about it because you know that there's a reason for it, and you know how to transmute it. This is the house of alchemy. So it's being able to take something that feels really yuck and turn it into something that is very valuable, like gold. And also the fear of death. The 8th house is the house of death. And sometimes people don't realize that they're afraid of death in some of their behaviors. Like they may, I think like Saturn here, Saturn in the 8th can be like fears of like growing old and maybe having poverty or something like that. And some of these fears that people have, they're not really, it's not to say that they're irrational. They could be from another lifetime where they actually experienced this. And it's important to definitely not kind of like dismiss your fears. But sometimes people, they are constantly having anxiety about things like, let's say in the future, that are not necessarily going to happen. And so, I think of OCD, and I've said that I believe that addictions are a form of obsessive compulsive disorder, where people feel compelled to do something, and it actually has a harmful effect, but they seem to not be able to control, going towards something. And we always think of OCD in other respects, but it can. I feel that because the 8th house can be about obsession under the sign of Scorpio. Because it is ruled by Scorpio, and so obsessions. I once read that OCD is created by our psyches in order to distract us from serious problems, so that we can focus on these rituals, on this minutia that other people wouldn't even think about, but we are so obsessed about. And even like drugs, sometimes there's like a very elaborate ritual that a person goes through to prepare the drugs, to like get the drugs, the whole 9 yards, and they get totally involved in that. And then they don't have to focus on things that are really scary to them. And it takes their mind off of that, gives their mind somewhere else to focus on. So it's very, very interesting how, what our motivations are at the core level. Okay, now in the 12th house, this is very interesting because the 12th house is the house of Pisces and its ruler Neptune. And, this is the house of spiritual transcendence. So merging with the universe. Like, wow, man, like, that's really groovy. When people are taking acid and all of that. See, I never have taken those kinds of drugs, acid and those stronger psychedelics, and the change of consciousness that people experienced was absolutely unprecedented, because of the era that this, really evolved, blossomed during, which was, I would say, in particular, the mid 60s onwards. But there were people, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, there were people that were taking psychedelics long before William Burroughs. He became a heroin addict, but I mean, I shouldn't say that William Burroughs took psychedelics. I'm not sure about that, but I know Jack Kerouac and his, I was going to say his merry pranksters, but that's Ken Kesey. That's like a different, the Kool-Aid acid test. They actually were inspired by the Beat generation, I would say. I haven't read that material in a long time, so I can't say for sure. But yeah, they were doing that long before then. And I'm always impressed with people who are ahead of their times. It's easy to go along with the program and just do what the masses are doing. Another thing that is really important to note that has to do with that scene is that there is I'm going to put this in air quotes, conspiracy theory that the CIA created the Summer of Love in 1967. There's a book called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon about Laurel Canyon and that being the epicenter of the rock stars that were, instrumental in kind of promoting flower power and how they came from military families and why would the CIA put acid into this Haight-Ashbury into this community in San Francisco? Why would they do that? Well, we had a Vietnam War happening and we had protesters, and that kind of pacifies people. It's not the first time the CIA has been accused of planting drugs in communities. They did, supposedly did that in the mid 80s too, and really created the crack epidemic. Doesn't mean that there wasn't cocaine, problems big time, not just in the 80s, in the early 80s, but even in the 70s. And there were people, using cocaine in the 20s. I remember my late uncle told me one time, who was probably born in the late teens, and he said all that stuff about the 60s and the drug, generation, they were doing that in the 20s. And I was reading stuff about the silent movie industry, and the Keystone Cops, if you've ever seen those old films, they said that was based on cocaine. They were herky jerky and they were just totally wired, and the camera, all of that, it was, I don't know if that's true, but so there's nothing new under the sun. But the certain things that might have been manipulated may have encouraged more people to participate than normally would have. So the 12th house is the house of the spiritual dimensions. This is not a practical house like its opposite house, an opposite sign, the 6th house, under the rulership of Virgo and its ruler of Mercury. The 6th house is an earth house, the 12th house is a water house. And so that spiritual desires in the 12th house can cause a person to maybe want to join the priesthood. The 12th house is the house of hermits and monks and people who isolate from society so that they can find God easier, so they don't have that noise that distracts them from finding God. Well, sometimes people want to take a shortcut. The question is, can you take a shortcut? I think that I don't think anybody can judge for another person. They're choosing plant medicine, and I would include, not just ayahuasca, but peyote, mushrooms, all those things that expand the consciousness. Nobody can say to another person, "Oh, that's completely worthless, and you shouldn't have done that." I just, when I act in a cautious way, it's because so many people are completely, pro using it, and they don't realize that some people, it could, have some negative effects. And, people should be very well educated before they do something that has that potential to really, create a new type of outlook for themselves, because it may have other, side effects. And there's no harm in investigating. But there are people who say that they feel like it really helped them, and maybe even some people with trauma. So, again, do your homework. But that's why, because when I talk about this, I'm just going to be talking about it, but I'm going to meet, I don't like to make it sound like it's just for everybody, because I don't believe that it is. So some people feel like this, like they even have memories of maybe the other side, because the 12th house can be past lifetimes. It's the house of karma. People should not interpret that to mean punishment, although it is the house of prisons. So that is the place of atonement, or whatever you want to call it, a prison. So it's the house of hospitals, so people who are suffering. And it is the house, because it is the house of past lifetimes, a lot of us come into this lifetime with amnesia. We don't remember past lifetimes. And I read it in some astrological resource that if you have plants in the 12th house, this can indicate unfinished business that that you bring into this lifetime. And I believe that they might have meant all planets, not just personal planets. But certainly if you do have personal planets like the sun in the 12th or the moon, you may have psychic ability, but you may be a very big empath. And empaths can feel the weight of the world emotionally. They can tune into other people's feelings. Sometimes they don't even know that that's happening. I consider myself an empath, even though I don't have inner planets in water. And I know sometimes I'm like, okay, why do I feel sad? Why do I feel, this sense of anxiety when there's nothing in my conscious environment that is causing that? And then I think maybe I'm tuning into maybe somebody that is connected to me, through a close relationship, or who knows? Or maybe it's just somebody that happens to be walking down the street. So you might, if you have inner planets like this, you may feel that really, I was going to say really weighing you down. Chiron in the 12th house can be somebody that feels this, who always feels guilty about, I sounded like Canadian. I said like a boot. I almost said about their life. Like they're bringing in past lifetimes where maybe something did happen and they feel like they have to atone for some sin, but it must suck if you don't remember what that was, So, some people are always apologizing, like someone will bump into them and they will apologize for it, like they caused it, even though the other person caused it. So irrational guilt, that can be a sign that maybe there is something that is creating that at a deeper level that you're not aware of. Some people choose past life regression, where they may get in touch with this, of like what exactly is doing this. And that might be very helpful. This is another thing that I feel is not necessarily for everyone, because I have no desire to find out about my past lives. I have like some theories about past lives that I have, and I'm amused by them, but I don't care to validate them because I feel like it's a Pandora's box. I feel like there's a reason why we're kept from, knowing it on the conscious level sometimes. And, think about all the emotional baggage you may be carrying around from childhood. Do you really want to add another how many lifetimes worth of it? But sometimes it might be very enlightening. And if, for instance, if you have certain feelings that feel irrational, it might help you to see why it is. And who knows, maybe you could clear some things up. So again, it's not either or. But yeah, so with the 12th house, this is because it is ruled by Neptune. I feel like escapism can be a key here. If you have Mars, okay, this is the house of, what do you call it? Self-undoing. So self-destructive tendencies can be the 12th house. If you have Mars here, be careful that you don't just dive right or are drawn to the moth to the flame, and that you just find yourself strangely drawn to situations where you are being self-destructive. Sometimes there's a very good reason. It's because the person feels guilty. They feel like they've done something wrong. Maybe they come from a family of addiction and they had a parent that said, you made me like this. It's because of you that I'm like this. And they feel guilty. They feel like they're responsible. It could be that they just have this feeling that they did something wrong. Maybe it came from another lifetime and they are trying to atone for that by, being as humble as possible, whatever you want to call it, self-sacrificing, but it is destroying their life. A sacrifice, I don't like the word sacrifice because it implies that someone is losing out on that deal. You're giving to someone else at your own expense. If something is truly a gift to others, I believe it will be a gift to you. I don't believe that you will feel that sense of depletion if you're doing something that is truly in alignment with your higher purpose. So in terms of escapism, the person may feel this sense of life is too harsh. If you have the moon in particular in the 12th, but even the sun, you may have social anxiety and you may just want to run and hide all the time. People talk about autism. I could be completely wrong about this. I have no training in the medical field or whatever, psychological fields. But I see all these people and they're saying they're autistic, but they're so in touch with, they're so like self-aware at a deep level. I don't believe that's autism because that's why autism is a disability. Autistic people with autism have a lack of self-awareness. And so they kind of are a little bit too, open to the point where they're naive and they're not socially aware, and other people don't understand like what is this behavior. And I have seen this, people who are on the mild end who are very they're very like childlike even into their 20s. They may have temper tantrums. There might be emotional immaturity. They have meltdowns because they can't really regulate themselves very well. And they have that confusion, because we all know when we're being dissed at a certain level, and they know, that there are issues. They might have been in special education. That's a field that I worked in briefly, and I, as a teacher's assistant, and the children that had different disabilities like autism, but other things, physically they looked like everybody else, but they were not that way intellectually and emotionally, and they were mainstreamed with some of those classes. And in a way, I thought that was cruel because they were comparing themselves, and these were middle schoolers when they were, they're just like everybody else. They want to fit in. They want to be like everyone else, and they knew that they weren't. And so I'm sure that adults with autism who are aware of it, that they know, but they just don't, they have that lack of understanding of how they're coming across to other people. But the people who are being diagnosed with autism, who I don't feel are autistic, they might have certain, I don't know what you call it, like symptoms, characteristics. I do. I can't stand loud noises. I want I want to wear those big bulky headphones that they give to the kids with autism so they don't have these loud noises in public. I do have big padded headphones, but I need even bigger ones. And just certain things like being awkward, socially awkward is one of them. That doesn't mean that that's a disability. It just means that a person is different than the average person. Being neurodivergent, that is not a disability. The person can be brilliant, and they can be, they can think outside the box a lot of times when everybody else is kind of in this herd mentality. That's, we're making disabilities out of something that are actually characteristics that may indicate that somebody is spiritually advanced, and therefore their senses are very engaged, and that's why they do react to loud noises or bright lights or something like that. But in any case, being socially not wanting to be in social situations doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It's the only problem is if the person can't function, because sometimes you can't just stay holed up in your house all the time. You have to interact in public, and if you're so timid that you can't ask somebody for directions, or like if that produces anxiety within yourself, then that is something to look at. But sometimes this is because the person was diagnosed with social anxiety, that they start to really believe that they have this thing, which might not really have been such a big deal in the first place, but was overblown. But it was overblown at a time when they were very impressionable, like in adolescence. I was part of I said this in another video. I did a video on neurodivergent people. If you're interested in that, if you think that you're like that, check my channel. I can't remember the name of it, but I did do one on that, which was very fun to do, because I think that a lot of people, especially under the age of 30, have been subjected to this. And I'm not saying that people don't have ADD. I think I do, and I'm almost 60 years old at the time of this recording. And there was nothing called that back then in the 70s. So what do you do when something happens like that? Does that mean you don't have it? It's like the Zen koan. If nobody, hears the tree, if you're the only one that hears the tree, it doesn't exist when it falls. It exists. But thank God, I'm so glad that I didn't have a diagnosis where they were going to put me on a drug that's addictive so I can concentrate. Because I think that knowledge is power. I think just knowing that you have it, and maybe if you need some kind of adaptations in school because you have certain things that put you at a disadvantage, then that's cool. like an IEP, that's absolutely fine. But this idea of like, oh yeah, you are socially anxious because you are an introvert. So da 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 da. This is what you are. And then you may feel self-conscious about that, and then you kind of maybe your parents do, and then they overblow it, and they like exaggerate, how this is really going to impact your life. And that's what to me is so dangerous about those things, is because you never know exactly how it really was, how serious it really was, because it was at that time in life when you naturally would be very self-conscious. Teenagers are naturally self-conscious, and they're naturally very self-centered, where they think that everybody's looking at them, um, and everybody cares when everybody's looking at themselves. So that is not abnormal at all. But if you are on the introverted side, that just adds a little bit of a challenge, because that's the time when people are starting to date, and they're starting to really maybe trying to assert themselves more, and it can create, certain symptoms of anxiety that, maybe there needs to be strategies that are implemented to help people. What can you do if you have these situations? So when I talk about the 12th house, I don't want to make it seem like if you love to be alone, that there's something wrong with that. No, being introverted is cool. I think it's very cool. And there's a saying that people who are introverted get drained by being too much in contact with other people. And people who are extroverted, they get their energy from other people. So that's why they like to be with other people, because it energizes them. So you can see they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. And so if you feel drained, like spending too much time around other people, and you love solitude, and you have planets like the sun, for instance, in the 12th house, then I don't see the reason to embrace it, as long as you're not isolating, like you're self-isolating, and it's due to depression, and maybe, or that it's causing depression, and that you feel anxious going outside, like you feel that everybody's looking at you, and like, what are you looking at? If that, that paranoia. And by the way, if you feel paranoia once in a while, I think that that's normal too, because sometimes we're in our heads, and, it just, being introverted, it's like you can nourish yourself if it's a healthy form of introversion. But some people, like if your moon is in the 12th house, you may feel lonely. You may always feel like nobody understands how you feel. And they might not your immediate family. You may be more like the starseed, the empath, who is very sensitive, but you're surrounded by people who are just like very extroverted, and they have no qualms about mingling with other people. And you are different. They may even make you the scapegoat in some cases, and that may cause you to feel like there's something wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. I could say there's something wrong with them, but I don't want to make anybody wrong. It's just different. Okay? And so our society is built on those people. And they sometimes will expect everybody to behave like that. But you have to cultivate a sense of inner strength, where you realize that you are okay as is, that you don't have to fit into the masses of people. And it's hard to do sometimes, because there are lots of different areas of life telling you, trying to indoctrinate you and tell you how you're supposed to be. So you have to have that mental and spiritual strength to withstand that kind of, I call it gaslighting, to be honest with you. I think that they're lying to us. I think that they're trying to make us feel crazy sometimes for being different. But anyway, And I don't have any planets in the 12th house. But if you do, like I said, the moon, you may have felt emotional deprivation, and that causes you to numb out with some substance because you feel like this pain. You feel like you're just always so sensitive. It would behoove somebody like this to begin to, I think in those cases, to take yourself out of isolation so that you're not hyper focused on yourself, because it could be very self-centered. It could be the person who is really, they are a healer, but they're so focused on getting their needs met that they're not able to help other people yet. And it can be like, if a person is unconscious and they're going through life like this, they can be like an energy vampire, or what I would call not a malignant narcissist, but a covert narcissist, which is a narcissist who is, they always have problems, and they're always trying to get attention from other people because of their problems. And it could be just their emotional state, like, I'm lonely, I'm sad, come rescue me, and all of that. And this is like a maladaptive, thing that they're doing to get their needs met. Everybody is trying to get their needs met. A heroin addict is trying to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. And another thing too, which when I said about heroin addicts, I have the opportunity to observe heroin addicts and people on, especially young people, which is really kind of sad that when you see people that are in their 20s and they're on hardcore drugs. But it's been a thing. This is not new, for sure. I've been seeing this for 30 years, ever since the first Gulf War, which is not a surprise. Afghanistan is a big opium producer. But anyway, so what I notice is that there is this sense of people who are, it's like I can tell that they feel sorry for themselves, and they probably have been abused. But there's that Piscean thing going on, and it could be like a 12th house thing. Because for instance, if you have the moon in the 12th house, it's like you have your moon in Pisces. Now, it's not exactly like that, because you have to see what sign the moon is in. It's going to, it won't present itself exactly that way. If your moon is in Aries and it's in the 12th house, it's not going to be like totally like that. But some people, they have been victims in life, and when they become adults, they take over from their abuser. They start beating themselves up. Sticking a needle in your arm is a form of self-abuse. This is what I'm talking about when I say self-destruction, self-destructive behaviors. And sometimes they carry signs, and they're like, can you give me money? And because they're just in that victim mentality and mode. And their facial expressions. And, sometimes I see through it. I see that there's something else there. It's not that pitiful quality. It's something that they're cultivating, consciously cultivating. Well, I shouldn't say consciously. It's just like a default that they just have had this situation. So look at this. If you have these types of things, and it's not to say, oh, you feel sorry for yourself, get over yourself. It's not to be hard-hearted about it, but it is, this is why it is so ingenious to talk about narcissism as it pertains to covert narcissism and not just malignant narcissism. Because some people, when you are abused, you are being focused on by somebody else. Now it's a very negative focus, but it is a focus, and it makes you special compared to if you come from a family and you were the one who was like the black sheep, the scapegoat, you were special in a negative way. So in order to maintain that specialness, what are you going to do as an adult? Are you going to be the biggest fuck up on the planet in your community? The one that, dropped out of school or did it. And I'm not saying that makes somebody a fuck up. I'm just saying like the whole thing. If somebody just gets involved, I'm not saying that if somebody's on drugs that they are a fuck up. I'm saying that that label that was always on you that you're just kind of keeping it alive. And it's really about letting go of your story. Like, who would you be without your story? So we talk about the thing like the sob story of like, oh, when I was, and I get a lot of people who tell me about their lives, but they're not doing it in a self-pitying way. That's not, just because you talk about the things that happen to you doesn't mean that you're using that as a way to get other people to pity you, because, there's a difference between being pitied and being respected. And sometimes people can't see that difference. They're just wanting to be pitied for whatever reason. They confuse it with being loved, with being cared about. And when you really build your self-respect, that's the last thing that you want. You don't want people to feel sorry for you. You don't even need people to respect you, really, You just want to be free. And the 12th house, when somebody, is motivated towards self-destruction, they are not free. They are they're being pulled by something invisible sometimes. And it could be, again, those past life memories that are submerged, they're unconscious. It could be like a trauma if you have Pluto in the 12th. I think Mars too, but especially Pluto, because sometimes the mind, in its infinite wisdom, will make a memory completely unconscious to the person so that they can function in life. If it's some kind of like major, major, major trauma. And yet, at some point, maybe when the person is old enough and the consciousness feels it is safe, or they get triggered by something. Like an example is sexual abuse. Now, some people are conscious of sexual abuse, but sometimes for whatever reason, they're not. But they always have like a weird, like they're very fearful about, somebody talks about sex and they tighten up, they clench up. They're very, they don't want to talk about, they get angry. They just don't want to talk about it. Or, they're always, like I'm just speaking specifically of women, when let's say they're girls, the teenagers, and they dress down. They never dress in a way that shows their body. They wear baggy clothing and that kind of thing. Eating disorders, anorexia, that can be, there's just, these other effects that are happening, but they don't consciously know that they were sexually abused. Then they get older, maybe they do have kids. They do eventually have sex and they have kids. And let's say they have a daughter and she becomes 7 years old and that was the age that they were abused. All of a sudden the memories start flooding because they see their life through their daughter's eyes and they become very protective of her because they remember. It's like when they look at their daughter, they look at themselves. Or maybe it's even younger, gosh, And all of a sudden, they start remembering things. And this can be very traumatic to have it flood their conscious memory. So just understand that these things can control people for a long period of time. And they have no knowledge. And that, going back to the plant medicine, some people have said they've accessed these stored memories through that. Like ayahuasca specifically. But the thing is, it's not just about accessing it, because again, that can open the Pandora's box. What are you going to do with that? It has to be integrated. So that can be another reason. It's just like the person who feels like they want to have intimacy. They want to have meaningful relationships. but they feel like the way that they get their needs met is about being the victim. Because, a lot of people are good-hearted people, and if they see somebody on the street that they know is using, they know is hungry, they might give a few bucks to that person to help them. And that makes that person feel validated, seen. Feeling seen is a big one. If you have plants in the 12th house, maybe you felt like you were ignored in life. And so it's like trying to get that attention and be seen, but it's coming at your own expense because you're putting yourself through through self-abuse to get that sort of compassion from other people. And I think the thing that is most important to realize is that you can give yourself the kind of nurturing that maybe you didn't get. Maybe you come from a family of substance abuse and you were neglected, and the people around you that were supposed to care for you, they weren't even able to make you breakfast and you had to make it on your own. And that felt like you were unloved, especially if you're a water sign and that is very important to you. If you're a fire sign, maybe you're like, oh, I love this independence. I love being able to do something for myself. But for someone like who's very emotionally sensitive, it can feel like neglect. It is neglect. But it's not, if it's addiction on the parents' part, it's not malicious. It's not malicious. It's because they're in pain. And so that, and then that ancestral karma can be carried on down the line. And will you break it? You can break it. And I hope that people realize that their astrological charts are not set in stone, that, they can heal from it. It's giving you this cosmic template. And, you're able to see what needs to be changed and then to go about changing them. Okay, thank you for listening. I'm going to be doing a third part, which is going to be talking about the different elements and what they tend to gravitate towards. And I think I'm going to have the aspects that can indicate some of these addictive tendencies as well. If you would like a private reading, the link is below. Take care. Bye.